Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
In the early hours of the 11th of July 2022, a 25-year-old pizza delivery driver called Nicholas Bostic was driving through Indiana when he noticed a house on fire. He stopped, he entered through an unlocked back door, and inside he found 4 children upstairs and got them outside. Then he asked one simple question. Is that everyone? Turns out it wasn't. The 6-year-old girl was still somewhere inside. By then, the fire had changed completely. The smoke was black, the heat was building, and Bostic had already experienced enough to understand exactly what he was choosing. He went back in anyway. No BA, no PPE, no radio, no crew waiting behind him. Just one ordinary man who knew a child was still inside and decided that leaving her there was not an option. This episode is about people like him. Now, over the course of the last year, I've done a tremendous amount of traveling, probably more than I ever have done in my whole life, to be honest. A lot of that's been with the podcast. I've spent time with firefighters, rescue teams, instructors, leaders of organizations across different countries, cultures, and many different systems. And wherever I've gone, we've naturally talked about the people who do extraordinary things once they're in the job. People who perform under pressure, who run towards danger, to people who remain calm when everything else around them is in chaos. I try and study them, we interview them maybe, we build training around them, and we ask, what makes a great firefighter? What makes a great first responder, a great rescuer, or a great leader? But during all that traveling, something else just keeps on coming back to me. Before someone becomes a firefighter, or a paramedic, or a police officer, or a soldier, or a member of a rescue team, they're just a person. And if we're serious about understanding the type of people we want in these jobs, perhaps we should spend a bit more time looking at the people who are already doing the right thing before anybody gave them a uniform. Because helping someone doesn't require a rank, doesn't require a badge, it doesn't require a radio, a BA set, or permission from an incident commander. Being the difference in somebody's moment of crisis and chaos doesn't begin when you join the emergency services. For some people, it's already part of who they are. And sometimes, if we're completely honest, in my opinion, the uniform can even make doing the right thing even more complicated. Sometimes the rules, the policies, and the procedures, they're there for important reasons. Yeah, I get that. They protect us, they create discipline, they stop emotion and good intentions from turning one casualty into 2. But sometimes the things designed to guide us can also constrain us. Sometimes systems become slow, sometimes responsibility becomes diluted. Sometimes people wait for permission when the moment demands action. This episode is not an argument for members of the public to just go running into burning buildings, entering moving water, or climbing unstable structures to put themselves at reckless harm. That's not the message. The message is that courage, compassion, initiative, and service are not owned by people in the emergency services and the first responder sector. They exist everywhere. Every single day across the world, ordinary people step forward. They make a phone call. They give first aid. They challenge an unsafe decision. They pull someone from danger. They refuse to leave somebody behind. Most of those moments will never be filmed, even in the world of social media that we have now. They'll never receive an award, and they'll never become part of some sort of formally recorded history in our books. But they happen every day, every minute, every moment. So, there's no technical masterclass here in this episode. There's no attempt to solve one of the fire service's great debates. This is very much a one-off, unless we get some tremendous feedback that we want more of this. It's a story-led episode, and I wanted to make one of these for a while. I've been gathering these together, and I hope you find it as interesting as I found it researching. Normally, the podcast focuses on people who are trained to move forwards into danger, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and those professional people in the places that they find themselves inside somebody else's worst day. This is about everyone else. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Some of the people in these stories made intelligent, improvised decisions. Some survived despite accepting risks that could easily have created another casualty. So one of the questions running through the episode is where courage ends and recklessness begins. Every single case that I'm going to put to you has been selected because the action directly improves someone else's chance of survival. Maybe it involved a genuine personal risk, and also It's supported by checkable accounts. You can go and have a look at these. You can Google them. You can find these stories. So this is a deliberate change of gear for the Firefighters podcast. And it's a one-off episode just recognizing some of the ordinary people whose extraordinary actions were documented. Not because they were fearless and not because they were invincible and not because they were looking to become heroes. They simply found themselves in somebody else's worst moment and they chose to help. So we're going to begin where I started, on the cold open with a fire, and with a decision that often says most about the rescuer. It's not the first decision to enter, it's the decision to go back. It is beyond a privilege to be able to bring the Firefighters podcast to you, and we are so grateful for every single person that supports, listens, shares, and follows our journey. And to help us keep doing it, create more, reach more guests internationally, and make the podcast sustainable, we're asking for you to help. And to do this, we've set up a Patreon page. By joining our Patreon community, you will get access to every single full episode archive we have ever made. Now, hundreds and hundreds of key documents that we've got in there on fire behavior, firefighter health, cancer risks, instant debriefs, and so much more. So if you feel like you want to join the Patreon crew and help us make this possible, head to patreon.com/TFFPC or check the link in any episode podcast notes. So Nicholas Bostic had already led 4 children out of the house fire when he learned that a 6-year-old was missing. The conditions he had entered in the first time no longer existed. A rapid change in the fire had filled the property with dense smoke, and he searched the upstairs rooms but found nothing. He reached a second floor window and he could have escaped. Then he heard a child crying below him. He moved back down into the smoke, searching by the sound and touch alone because he could no longer see. And he eventually found Kalani and picked her up. On the way out, he lost the staircase, tripped and fell, and he later remembered thinking that they were both finished. He found a bedroom the fire had not yet reached and tried the window. Curtains and blinds blocked the opening. A cord became tangled around the child's ankle. Bostic didn't simply pull harder. He forced himself to slow down and free her properly while the room filled with smoke. Then he punched through the window. First strike failed. Second one went through and cut deeply into his arm. Kalani told him she didn't want to jump. He had no safe option left to offer her. So Bostic ran at the opening and threw himself through it, twisting in the air so his body took the impact and the child landed clear. He carried her around the outside of the house, handed her to police officers and collapsed, repeatedly asking whether the child was all right. All 5 children survived. Bostic required treatment for severe smoke inhalation and the injury to his arm. The local fire chief, after nearly 4 decades in the job, said the children would not have survived without his actions. The easy version of the story is that he was brave enough to enter the burning building. The more revealing version is that he came out, understood the danger, learned that 1 child remained inside and deliberately went back. First entry might have been instinct. The second was definitely a decision. Next, we look at Wesley Autry, 9 seconds. This next rescue involved no smoke but almost no time. On the 2nd of January 2007, construction worker Wesley Autry was on a New York subway platform with his 2 young daughters when a student called Cameron Holopetter collapsed. Holopetter appeared to recover slowly, stood himself up, stumbled, and fell back onto the tracks. Autry saw the train lights coming around the bend. The distance and speed, as it was assessed later on by experts, gave him roughly 9 seconds to act. He handed the responsibility for his daughters to 2 nearby women. With little more than a look, he jumped in. He tried twice to lift Holopetter back onto the platform. Both attempts failed. The young man was disorientated and fighting against him. The train was now too close. Autry then made the decision to push Holopetter into the drainage trough between the rails, lay flat on top of him, and pinned his limbs down. The train passed over them. The clearance was so small that grease on the underside of the train marked Autry's hat. What looks like a wild act contained a piece of practical judgment. Autry worked in construction and had experienced operating in confined spaces. In the seconds available, he assessed the gap and he believed that both men could fit beneath the train. He couldn't remove the casualty from danger, so he changed the problem. That may be one of the recurring lessons in these stories. Extraordinary rescue is not always extraordinary strength. Sometimes it's ordinary experience applied at exactly the right second. In Paris, in 2018, Mamadou Gassama saw a crowd staring up at a building. They were staring up at a 4-year-old child that was hanging from outside a 4th floor balcony. People below were preparing to catch the child if he fell. Gassama chose a different solution. He decided to climb the outside of the building using the balcony rails, moving from one level to the next with no rope or no protection. Within a matter of seconds, he had reached the child and pulled him to safety. At the time, Gassama was an undocumented labourer from Mali. He had every reason to avoid attracting attention to himself from the authorities. Instead, he moved towards the most visible place in the street. The rescue changed his legal position and briefly opened a route into work with the Paris Fire Brigade, although the later reality was more complicated than the fairy tale version often reported. But the important part of the story lasts less than 1 minute. A crowd saw a falling child. One person saw a route. Child survived. In the early hours of the 22nd of April, 2018, a man called James Shaw Jr. was inside a Waffle House in Tennessee when a gunman opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle. Shaw was unarmed and trapped near a restroom door that didn't lock. A bullet had already grazed his arm. He later described a simple thought that if the gunman was going to kill him, he was going to have to work for it. Shaw watched, and for a moment, the rifle lowered. Evidence later indicated that the gunman was dealing with an empty magazine, but he still had more ammunition available. Shaw took his opportunity and moved. He drove the door into the attacker, grabbed the hot barrel with his bare hand, wrestled the weapon away and threw it behind the counter. His hands suffered burns from the metal. He forced the gunman out of the restaurant but didn't chase him because he didn't know whether a second weapon was present. No more shots were fired inside. Shaw was repeatedly resisted, being described as superhuman. He called himself a regular person who recognized a narrow opportunity. And that's exactly why the story belongs in here. Because he was definitely frightened, and he had no specialist training. He didn't know whether the next decision would work. He just observed one change in the threat and acted before the opportunity disappeared. The next story carries a celebrity name, but the reason it belongs here has very little to do with the person's fame. On the 19th of September 2008, a Learjet 60 attempted to take off from Columbia Metropolitan Airport in South Carolina. Multiple underinflated tires failed during the takeoff roll. The crew rejected the takeoff after the aircraft had passed the point at which it should have continued into the air. The aircraft overran the runway, crossed a public road, and struck an embankment. A major fuel-fed fire developed almost immediately. 4 of the 6 people on board died. The 2 survivors were Travis Barker, who's the drummer from Blink-182, and Adam Goldstein, better known as DJ AM. Both were seated towards the rear of the aircraft. Neither suffered an impact injury because they were wearing their seatbelts, which would have completely prevented movement. And that is what gave them a chance. The normal entrance was no longer usable. The only viable way out was a smaller emergency hatch near the rear lavatory, a detail that had been shown to them during the pre-flight briefing. Barker recognized it, opened it, and escaped through the rear of the aircraft. Upon escaping, both men were then engulfed in flames. They had to pass through the fire that was already burning outside of the wreckage. Their clothes ignited. Goldstein, as he weighed his way to the floor, used stop, drop, and roll. He then saw Barker still moving around while on fire, shouted at him to get down and help smother the flames. He also removed burning material from Barker's foot. Before the airport firefighters could even arrive to physically reach them, the 2 casualties had become each other's first rescuers. A passing motorist, William Owens, stopped and found the men trying to remove burning clothing. They told him that 4 others remained still inside, but the intensity of the fire made an approach impossible for an unprotected person. I think that moment matters too. Owens chose to stop. He gathered some information, he helped where conditions allowed, but he didn't enter a fuel-fed aircraft fire and become another casualty. Airport firefighting crews arrived within minutes to an aircraft heavily involved in fire. Burning fuel flowing across a road, in darkness, traffic hazards, uncertain information about who was trapped inside. But the fire was quickly controlled. But the rescue story itself, that had already taken place, had happened in the gap before their arrival. Both survivors suffered serious burns. Barker later described burns across most of his body. He had repeated operations, grafting, and months of hospital treatment. He didn't fly again for 13 years. Goldstein's visible injuries were less extensive, and he returned to work quickly, but surviving the aircraft was not the end of his emergency. People familiar with the story will know he had previous history of addiction, and after the crash he struggled with fear, pain, medication, depression, and also survivor's guilt. He died from an accidental overdose less than a year later. The medical examiner didn't classify the death as a direct consequence of the crash, but people close to him believed the trauma had reopened something he had spent years holding closed. Maybe that story gives it a second lesson as well. Sometimes a rescue can last seconds, but survival can take years. Barker and Goldstein remembered an exit, escaped, extinguished themselves, and helped one other. They did what they could in the first few minutes. The fact that one man's trauma continued on a longer and ultimately fatal timeline doesn't diminish the courage that they had in the moment. Maybe it also reveals the true length of an emergency. The next one also got a great deal of coverage in the press. Arland Williams and his act of giving away the line. Another aircraft crash produced one of the clearest acts of deliberate self-sacrifice, perhaps in documented history. In January 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the frozen Potomac River in Washington, D.C. 6 people initially survived in the water. A police helicopter arrived with improvised rescue equipment and lowered a line towards a man trapped in the tail section. The line reached him more than once. More than once, he passed it to somebody else. By the time the helicopter returned for him, the wreckage had settled and he'd disappeared beneath the water. It took 17 months to formally establish a man's identity as Arland D. Williams Jr.
I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
He was a great example of the fact that he didn't get carried away by one impulsive act. He repeatedly received an opportunity to survive, understood what it represented, and still gave it away. Heroism is often described as a moment, but Williams made the same choice several times. Now, not every rescue requires entering danger as such. On Boxing Day 2004, 10-year-old Tilly Smith was walking on a beach in Thailand with her family when she noticed that the sea was behaving quite strangely. The water continued moving inland without retreating. The surface appeared to froth, and boats on the horizon were moving violently. 2 weeks earlier, Tilly's geography teacher had shown the class footage of a tsunami and explained the warning signs. She recognized what she was seeing. Her parents didn't immediately believe her, and that's the crucial part of this story. Tilly didn't simply have the correct thought, she persisted until adults acted. Her warning was passed to the hotel staff, and the beach was cleared before the wave arrived. The commonly repeated claim that she personally saved 100 people is more confident than the evidence shows. Roughly that number may have been on the beach, but there's no reliable count of exactly whose survival depended on her warning. But the honest version is still pretty extraordinary. A child remembered a lesson, challenged adults, communicated the risk, and refused to stop until people acted. Rescue sometimes looks like a massive amount of strength, and sometimes it looks like being the only person in the room prepared to keep saying, something's wrong. Next, we have Wallace Crowther, the man who kept going back. On the morning of the 11th September 2001, Wallace Crowther was working on the 104th floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center. He was 24 years old and worked in finance, although he had been a volunteer firefighter since the age of 16 and had recently spoken about joining FDNY. When the aircraft struck the tower, Crowther made his way down towards the damaged sky lobby on the 78th floor. Only one of the 3 main stairways remained passable. Crowther found it. He pulled a red bandana over his face, organized volunteers, and led a group down towards clearer air. He carried a badly burned woman many, many floors, and then he told the group to continue, because he went back up. He found more injured people, gave instructions, helped organize them, and directed them towards the working staircase. Then he went back again. Crowther died when the tower collapsed. For months, survivors knew only that a young man wearing a red bandana had guided them through the smoke. It was actually his mother eventually recognized the description because Wallace had carried that bandana since childhood. Popular versions often claim that he saved 18 people. The precise number directly attributable to him can't really be proved, but the most careful official credit is that at least 5, with good reason to believe that the true figure was higher. Certainly doesn't weaken the story. I think it makes it more honest. Crowther had enough knowledge to understand the danger and enough opportunity to continue his own escape. Instead, he repeatedly used what time remained to help strangers find theirs. The next story is a little bit harder and maybe a little bit more honest because it doesn't give the rescuer the ending that we want. After the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995, Rebecca Anderson saw the destruction on TV. She was a 37-year-old nurse working in a care home. Nobody requested her attendance. Instead, she decided to drive to the scene because she believed people, including children from the building's daycare center, would need help. The Murrah Federal Building was not a stable rescue environment. Large section had already collapsed, and heavy concrete remained suspended or continued moving. Anderson entered the rubble without protective equipment and helped remove casualties. Accounts vary over the number of entries, but they agree that she was struck on the back of the head by falling material. She came out, said that she had been hit, and then returned to help again. She later collapsed with a seizure and died 4 days afterwards from internal brain injuries. Anderson is remembered as the bombing's final victim and the only rescue worker killed during the response. Now, her story shouldn't be used to question any of her compassion, but it should make us confront the reason professional rescue scenes require control, accountability, and specialist assessment. Hundreds of well-intentioned volunteers entered the damaged building during the early response. Later reviews concluded that many medical volunteers would have been more useful and safer supported hospitals rather than entering an actively failing structure. Courage, unfortunately, can't stabilize concrete, and compassion doesn't replace a structural assessment. Anderson's heart took her towards people who needed help. That was her purpose. That was what she felt she needed to do, and the environment still killed her. Next, we have Joe Rawlins, the 13-year-old rescuer. In February 2018, 13-year-old Joe Rawlins went kayaking off Anglesey with his father, Paul. They'd forgotten their life jackets but continued because the sea appeared calm. A loose hatch allowed the kayak to fill with water and capsize. After repeated attempts to reboard, they decided to swim towards an island. Paul began to suffer severe hypothermia. His arms stopped working, he became confused, and then lost consciousness in the water. Joe reached safety, looked back and saw his father floating motionless. He swam back. He towed a 15-stone unconscious adult to the rocks, pulled him out, and began CPR using knowledge he had picked up from videos, films, and grown up around parents who had worked in the emergency services. His father began coughing and breathing, but the rescue wasn't finished. The tide was covering the rocks, so Joe moved him again across the rough ground to higher shelter. He kept him awake and talking for more than 2 hours until a lifeboat and Coast Guard crews located them. But Joey and his dad survived. In that, Joe didn't perform just one dramatic act. He completed a sequence of correct decisions while cold, frightened, injured, and only 13 years old. He recognized the unconsciousness. He re-entered the water. He improvised a tow. He attempted resuscitation. He reassessed the rising tide. He moved his dad again, and he protected him from further exposure. I think this one might be the purest example of an ordinary person becoming the entire rescue system, because nobody else was there yet. This next one is one that maybe stops this episode just being a simple celebration of intervention, because just after midnight on the 24th of April 2021, 2 strangers near London Bridge heard a woman screaming from the River Thames. Fuller Jimmy Olabumniadawal, also known as Jimmy, called 999. He and Joaquin Garcia then entered the river with seconds of each other. The water was blisteringly cold. It was dark. It was fast-moving. Garcia reached the woman. He removed a heavy coat that was pulling her down and held her afloat until professional rescuers arrived. The woman survived. Garcia survived. Jimmy didn't. His body was recovered several hours later. Both men made the same moral decision. Another person was drowning, and they couldn't stand on the bank and do nothing. The outcome wasn't determined by who was braver. Cold, fast-moving water doesn't reward courage, strength, or good intentions. It can rapidly disable even a capable swimmer. That's exactly why professional water safety advice is so blunt. Call for help, reach or throw something that floats, and do not enter unless properly trained and equipped. It'd be easy to finish this story by saying Jimmy shouldn't have gone in. But I think that's too simple. His courage was definitely real, and the danger was also real. This is the uncomfortable line that first responders, firefighters have to manage professionally. The need to act set against the responsibility not to create just another casualty. The discipline that we face in rescue is not about caring less. It's about finding a way to help that doesn't remove you from the solution. Firefighters, police officers, and first responders are now stepping into environments wired with more high voltage than ever before. Everything from electric vehicles to solar panels feeding direct current through compromised structures, overhead power lines, and illicit drugs factories with improvised lethal bypasses. Any single strike in the wrong place in this type of environment can turn things fatal very quickly, and that is exactly why we've partnered with Jafco. You already know who Jafco are. They have been relied upon for decades for sturdy, get-the-job-done equipment, and they are not resting on their laurels. They are evolving to face the challenges first responders are handling today through their insulated tool range. These are purpose-built for the scenarios where contact with hidden electrical hazards isn't just possible, it is increasingly likely. Their insulated tools are engineered for real-world abuse and use, designed to keep firefighters, police officers, and all first responders alive in environments where electrification is outpacing policy, equipment, and training. And you know this. This is the kind of innovation our sector needs and the kind of investment organizations should be stepping up to support if we are serious about protecting first responders from fatal consequences. So a massive thank you to Jafco for backing the podcast and backing the crews on the ground. Go check them out, learn what they're doing, and bring that conversation into your service, because this isn't about the future, it's about right now. The next one takes us to Grenfell with Miguel Alves, and it presents a different version of the same difficult question. Shortly after 1 a.m. on the 14th of June 2017, resident Miguel Alves returned home with his wife. Their lift stopped on the 4th floor and opened into smoke near the level where the fire had started. Alves immediately believed the building was in danger. He then decided to climb 13 floors to his flat, woke his children, and knocked on the doors of neighbors, many of whom had no other warning that the fire was spreading. His family escaped long before the official stay put advice was formally withdrawn. At one stage, his wife had been told by a firefighter to tell the family to remain in their flat. Alves ignored that advice. Now, it doesn't prove that residents should routinely disregard firefighters' advice or that stay put is always wrong. Stay put depends on the building successfully containing fire and smoke within the flat of origin through its compartmentation. The Grenfell inquiry found that the building failed catastrophically to provide that protection and that the evacuation should have been ordered earlier. Alves possessed information the wider system had not yet processed. He had personally seen smoke at the fire floor. He had clear stairs. He recognized that the building was not behaving as people had been told it would. And his decision wasn't just blind rebellion against what firefighters were telling him to do. It was a rapid assessment based on what he could directly observe. The uncomfortable lesson isn't ignore professional advice. It's that advice is only as reliable as the assumptions underneath it, and the people inside an emergency may sometimes see the failure before our command structures do. Next, we have Nicholas Winton and Irina Sendler. This is a rescue without the drama. Some rescues don't happen in the flash. They're built through forms, phone calls, false identities, and repeated decisions to continue tomorrow. In 1938, Nicholas Winton travelled to Prague and encountered families displaced by the expansion of Nazi Germany. He returned to Britain and began organising the movement of children to safety. There was actually a film made about this, if you haven't already seen it. Now, each child required documents, a British family willing to receive them, and money guaranteed against their care. Winton worked after finishing his normal job, creating an administrative system because no official system was moving quickly enough. 8 transports carried 669 children to Britain before the outbreak of war closed the route. Winton was not the only person responsible. Others remained in Prague and accepted much greater physical danger. The polished version that turns the entire operation into the work of one heroic man is kind of incomplete. But his contribution proves something really important. Rescue can be organised from a desk. It can look like refusing to let a delayed permit become a death sentence. In Warsaw, Irina Sandler used her work as a social worker and public health official to enter the Jewish ghetto during the Nazi occupation. Helping Jewish people escape carried the threat of execution for her. Sandler and the wider network smuggled children out through ambulances, toolboxes, buildings, and false identities. She kept records, linking their true names to the identities used to hide them, hoping that families might eventually be reunited. She was arrested, tortured, and sentenced to death. But then the resistance secured her release. She returned to the work under a false name. And again, the most famous number attached to her story, 2,500 children, which represents the wider network's reach rather than a reliable personal tally. The correct version remains almost impossible to comprehend. She knowingly entered danger over and over, not for seconds, but for years. And we tend to picture courage as an explosion of action, whereas Winton and Sandler show another form of it, which is persistence. One letter, a forged document, one child, then beginning again the next morning. Next, we move up in scale. Because after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, bridges and tunnels out of the lower Manhattan were closed. Hundreds of thousands of people moved towards the waterfront with no clear route off the island. Then the boats began arriving. Ferries, tugboats, sightseeing vessels, working boats and private craft started collecting people. The Coast Guard radio call eventually asked everyone available as a vessel to assist, but many operators were already moving before the call was transmitted. There was no perfect command structure at the beginning. People just saw the problem and used the equipment they already had to become part of the solution. The exact number evacuated carries between accounts, but the operational move was enormous. The population that moved by water within hours did so without the loss of life during any of the evacuation. A retired fireboat called the John J. Harbour also returned to service. Volunteers had preserved it after decommissioning, and when water infrastructure failed at ground zero, the old vessel was put back to work and pumped for days. A boat that had just been kept alive because people cared about its history became operationally useful when the modern system was damaged. 61 years earlier, another improvised fleet formed during the evacuation from Dunkirk. Simplify's national story says that civilian owners jumped into small boats and sailed independently towards France. The reality was more organised and more military than that. Many of the vessels were requisitioned and crewed by Royal Navy personnel. But one civilian crewed boat belongs directly in this, which is the Massey Shore, which was London Fire Brigade's fireboat. When volunteers were requested, 13 firefighters were selected within 2 hours. They crossed the channel under attack, made repeated journeys, moved soldiers from beaches to larger ships, brought others directly home and helped rescue casualties from the damaged vessel. They then returned to London and continued serving through the Blitz. The reason I wanted to include this one, and maybe these last two stories, is not necessarily the number of people that were rescued, but it's the same reason that we began with Nicholas Bostic. Somebody saw an emergency before a complete system existed to manage it, and they just used what was available. A car, a construction worker's understanding of space, a safety briefing, geography lesson, a kayak, a typewriter, a tugboat, a fireboat. The tools were very ordinary. It's just the decision that wasn't. The thing I want to take away from this as we close is that every person in this episode was already there. They were driving past, traveling home, standing on a platform, sitting inside the aircraft, walking on a beach, or carrying out an ordinary day's work. Then another human being needed help. Most of us will never know what we would do in that exact moment, and we should be cautious about judging those who freeze or hesitate or can't intervene safely. But these stories, I think, reveal something a bit more hopeful, and it's what I really wanted to get across with this episode, because people don't always panic during disasters. Some of them communicate, they improvise, they cooperate, they use skills that's learned in completely different parts of their lives. Sometimes they place themselves at enormous risk for people that they've never met. Those of us who do this professionally train. We train so that useful action is more likely than unnecessary risk. We arrive with lots of equipment, we've got a command structure, we've got teamwork, and usually we've got a bit of a plan or a procedure. The public don't have any of those advantages. More often than not, the emergency arrives before we do, and an ordinary person becomes the first rescuer on scene. Now, I want to be completely clear again that I am not saying and not encouraging members of the public to run into burning buildings. I'm not telling untrained people to enter moving water, climb unstable structures, approach violent incidents, or put themselves at extraordinary risk, because that can definitely harm you. It can devastate the people who love you, and it can turn one casualty into 2, 3, or more. The training that we do matters. The equipment that has been researched and that we utilize matters. The policies and procedures in command structures definitely matter. They exist because rescue cannot be built on good intentions alone. But I'm hoping perhaps the deeper lessons from these stories can also still be carried into our own world, particularly for those of us working in the emergency services, because underneath every example in this episode, there has been a pattern. It's a pattern of agency, of leadership, of action. Agency is recognizing that you are not powerless. Leadership is accepting that rank is not the only thing that gives you permission to help. And action is doing something useful with the situation that is actually in front of you. You may not be the most senior person in the room. You may not have the perfect qualifications. You might not be the official person that's actually responsible for this. And you may not know exactly what to say. But you are there. And sometimes being there is enough to begin. Maybe a colleague is struggling. Maybe a friend is withdrawing from everybody around them. Maybe a member of the public is frightened, confused, or completely overwhelmed. Maybe somebody needs your practical support. Maybe they need you to make a phone call, or they need you to challenge a decision. Maybe they need you to sit with them for 10 minutes and actually listen. Maybe they need you to notice that they're not okay before they've found the words to admit it themselves. You may not be the perfect person for those situations, but perfection isn't always what the moment requires. Sometimes the moment simply requires somebody who is willing to care enough to act. Doesn't mean pretending you can solve everything. And it doesn't mean operating beyond your competence, but it does mean taking responsibility for something that needs specialist help. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is recognize your own limitations and connect that person with somebody better equipped to support them. But you can still make the introduction, right? You can still stay with them while they make the call. You can still open the door. You can still refuse to let them disappear between systems, department, and responsibilities, which has certainly happened in my career. You can still choose not to walk past. I get it. I have used huge emotive and life-changing examples in this episode. Burning buildings, aircraft crashes, terrorist attacks, freezing water. The moments where people were deciding between life and death. But meaningful action doesn't always look dramatic. In fact, I think we regularly underestimate how small an action can be and still completely change the direction of somebody's life. Something as simple as a conversation can do it. A message at the right time can do it. Checking in again after somebody says that they're fine, they can do it. Offering an opportunity can do it. Speaking up when somebody's being ignored can do it. Believing someone when nobody else can do or wants to. You may never know what that small action interrupted. You may never know what decision they were close to making. You may never know what happened because you actually showed up. But that doesn't make the impact any less real. So no matter who you are, what rank you hold, and what job you do, or whether you work in the emergency services at all, to be fair, perhaps there is something here for you. Because the next time you find yourself thinking, I'm not qualified for this, I'm not the right person, somebody else will deal with it, ask yourself one more question. What could I do? What will I do? Not everything, not the impossible, not something reckless, just the next useful thing. Maybe you can't rescue them completely, but you might help them take one step towards safety. Maybe you can't resolve and totally solve their problem, but you might make sure they're not facing it alone. Maybe you can't be everything they need, but you can still be something. You can still choose to help. You can still dare yourself to try. You can still discover what is inside you that could make a meaningful difference to somebody else's life today. And I want to leave that sitting with you, because when your moment comes, whether it's loud and chaotic or quiet enough that nobody else even really notices it. I hope you choose to help. This episode has been a very, very, very different kind of episode for the Firefighters podcast, and probably a one-off where I really wanted to look at ordinary people doing extraordinary things because I think it matters. Hope you found it as interesting and powerful as I did researching it. Stay safe out there and never underestimate what an ordinary person may be capable of when somebody else needs them. I'll see you next time.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you took a lot away from that episode. We started the Firefighters podcast to develop, inspire, connect, motivate, represent, and most importantly, celebrate the world of incredible emergency services operators and the wider sector through this series of wide-ranging conversations. We really love creating this podcast and bringing it to so many people. Did you know you can also find these on YouTube? We do a lot of video podcasts now. You can head over to our YouTube page and follow, subscribe there. And as a final ask from us, whatever platform you're on, please rate the podcast. It really helps us as a key performance indicator to reach more and more people. I've been your host, Pete Wakefield. This has been the Firefighters Podcast. And wherever you are in the world, please stay safe, be happy, and where possible, please remember and support your firefighters and first responders. I'll see you next time.